Before the B-29 Superfortress killed the enemy, it was killing Americans, test pilots. For flight engineers, there was almost never a moment to relax. Every unusual temperature reading could be the first sign of another engine fire. Factory workers, entire crews. The aircraft that was supposed to become America's greatest weapon seemed determined to destroy itself before it ever reached the battlefield. Its engines caught fire without warning. Prototypes crashed from the sky. Flames erupted so fiercely that some crews barely had time to escape. Pilots began to fear the airplane. They flew almost as much as the enemy waiting for them. And yet, this same bomber would become the most advanced aircraft of the Second World War. It would fly farther than any bomber before it, higher than most enemy fighters could reach, carry larger bomb loads across the vast Pacific than any aircraft in history, and ultimately conduct two missions that would change the world forever. But before it became one of the most famous bombers ever built, engineers first had to stop it from destroying itself. This is the story of the B-29 Superfortress, the bomber that was killing Americans before it killed the enemy. In 1939, the United States wasn't at war, but American military planners were watching Europe with growing concern. Germany's invasion of Poland had demonstrated just how quickly modern warfare was evolving. Bombers were flying farther, fighters were becoming faster. Entire nations were falling in a matter of weeks. Across the Pacific, another threat was growing. Imperial Japan had already been fighting in China for years, steadily expanding its influence across Asia. Military leaders in Washington understood one uncomfortable reality. If America entered a war against Japan, distance would become its greatest enemy. Unlike Europe, the Pacific Ocean stretched across thousands of miles. Capturing every island one by one would take years and cost countless lives. America needed another option. It needed an aircraft capable of striking Japan without depending on nearby bases. And no airplane in the world could do that. In early 1940, the US Army Air Corps issued one of the most ambitious aircraft requirements in aviation history. It wasn't asking for a slightly better bomber. It was asking engineers to build something that barely seemed possible. The new aircraft needed to fly farther than any existing bomber, carry heavier bomb loads, cruise above 30,000 feet, where enemy fighters would struggle to intercept it, maintain high speed over enormous distances, and survive missions lasting well over a dozen hours. It sounded less like a military requirement and more like science fiction. Several companies submitted proposals: Lockheed, Douglas, Consolidated, Boeing. Only one design truly embraced the challenge. Boeing's proposal would eventually become the B-29 Superfortress. At first glance, the aircraft looked like a larger version of the B-17 Flying Fortress. 4 engines, a conventional tail, a familiar layout. But appearances were deceiving. The B-29 represented an entirely new generation of aviation. It introduced technology that had never before appeared together in a combat aircraft. Instead of forcing crews to endure freezing temperatures at extreme altitude, the bomber featured fully pressurized crew compartments. Pilots could fly above much of the enemy's air defenses without relying on bulky oxygen equipment for every moment of the mission. Then came another revolution: remote-controlled defensive gun turrets. Instead of sitting directly behind each machine gun, crew members controlled multiple turrets using sophisticated analog computers and optical sights. One gunner could even direct fire from several positions across the aircraft. Nothing like it had ever entered military service. The B-29 wasn't simply another bomber. It was decades ahead of its time. Powering this technological marvel required an equally ambitious engine: the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone. An enormous 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing more than 2,200 horsepower. 4 of them would propel the bomber across the Pacific. On paper, they promised exactly the performance engineers needed. Enough power to lift unprecedented bomb loads over unprecedented distances. But there was a problem. The engine itself was still under development. It had never been proven in an aircraft as large or demanding as the B-29. Both the bomber and the engines were being developed at the same time. America wasn't just building a revolutionary airplane, it was trying to solve 2 impossible engineering challenges simultaneously. As development accelerated, costs exploded. The B-29 rapidly became the most expensive aircraft project of the entire war. By the time production was underway, the United States had invested more than $3 billion into the program, more than the cost of the Manhattan Project during much of its wartime development. The numbers shocked even military planners. Factories had to be expanded. Thousands of workers required specialized training. Entire production lines were redesigned to manufacture aircraft unlike anything that had come before. Yet despite the staggering expense, almost everyone agreed. If the B-29 succeeded, it could change the course of the Pacific War. If it failed, America would lose one of the greatest industrial investments in its history. Boeing engineers faced enormous pressure. Every delay frustrated military commanders eager to take the fight directly to Japan, yet rushing development carried its own dangers. The aircraft incorporated so many new technologies that engineers constantly found themselves solving problems no one had encountered before. Pressurization systems leaked. Remote gun controls malfunctioned. Electrical systems grew increasingly complex. Weight climbed higher than expected. Every solution created another challenge. Still, progress continued, slowly, painfully, one problem at a time. Then, on September the 21st, 1942, the first prototype finally rolled onto the runway. Months of engineering, political pressure, and enormous financial risk had led to this moment. Test pilot Edmund "Eddie" Allen advanced the throttles. The 4 massive engines roared to life. The giant bomber accelerated down the runway. Then, almost effortlessly, it lifted into the air. The first flight lasted just over an hour. Despite a handful of minor issues, the prototype performed remarkably well. To many observers, it seemed America had done the impossible. The world's most advanced bomber had taken flight. Newspapers celebrated. Military leaders smiled. Boeing engineers allowed themselves a rare moment of optimism. Perhaps the hardest part was finally over. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because hidden beneath the B-29's revolutionary technology was a flaw so dangerous, it would soon kill some of America's finest pilots before the bomber ever had the chance to fight the enemy. The optimism surrounding the B-29's first flight didn't last long. Almost immediately, engineers began discovering problems that no amount of planning had prepared them for. Some were expected: minor mechanical faults, electrical glitches, hydraulic leaks. That was normal for a revolutionary aircraft. But one problem stood above all the others: the engines. The very machines designed to carry America's most advanced bomber across the Pacific were becoming its greatest weakness. The Wright RR-33-50 duplex Cyclone was an engineering marvel. Each engine displaced more than 3,300 cubic inches. 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 tightly packed rows, produced extraordinary power for the time. On paper, it was exactly what the B-29 needed. In reality, it was operating at the very edge of what engineering could safely achieve. The engine generated tremendous heat, too much heat. The tightly packed rear cylinders received less cooling airflow than those at the front. During long climbs or high-power operation, temperatures could rise dangerously. If they climbed high enough, oil began to break down. Components weakened, fuel ignited where it shouldn't. And once a fire started inside the engine, it often spread with terrifying speed. The danger didn't end there. Many of the engine's internal components were made from lightweight magnesium alloys. Magnesium reduced weight and improved performance, but it carried a deadly disadvantage. Once magnesium caught fire, it burned at temperatures so intense that ordinary firefighting methods became almost useless. Water could actually make the flames worse. Fire extinguishers often had little effect. Ground crews watched helplessly as entire engines were consumed. Pilots had only moments to react. Sometimes, they didn't even have that. Engine fires became alarmingly common during testing. A crew might complete several flights without incident. Then, without warning, smoke would begin pouring from one nacelle. Seconds later, flames erupted through the engine cowling. Pilots shut down the engine, activated the fire suppression system, prayed the flames would die. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. If the fire spread into the wing, the consequences were often catastrophic. Boeing engineers worked around the clock searching for solutions. Cooling baffles were redesigned, oil systems modified, engine cowlings reshaped to improve airflow. Every improvement solved one problem, only to reveal another. The aircraft itself wasn't fundamentally flawed. Its systems performed remarkably well. Its pressurized cabins worked. Its remote-controlled gun turrets showed enormous promise. Its aerodynamic design exceeded expectations. But everything depended on 4 engines that still couldn't be trusted. And without reliable engines, the world's most advanced bomber was little more than an extraordinary experiment. Then disaster struck. On February 18, 1943, one of the prototype B-29s lifted off from Boeing Field near Seattle for another routine test flight. At the controls was one of America's most respected test pilots, Edmund "Eddie" Allen. Allen wasn't simply another pilot. He had flown some of Boeing's most important aircraft. His calm judgment and technical expertise made him one of the country's most experienced experimental aviators. If anyone could safely evaluate the B-29, it was Eddie Allen. Shortly after takeoff, one of the engines caught fire. Witnesses saw flames growing larger by the second. Allen attempted to turn back toward the airfield, but the aircraft was losing power, losing altitude, and losing control. Knowing he couldn't reach the runway, Allen steered the giant bomber away from crowded neighborhoods for as long as possible. Moments later, the B-29 crashed into the Fry meatpacking plant south of downtown Seattle. The explosion devastated the building. 20 people were killed. Among them was Eddie Allen. It remains one of the deadliest aviation accidents in American history. The crash sent shockwaves through the entire B-29 program. Some officials questioned whether the aircraft should be grounded altogether. Others argued that the engines required years of additional development before the bomber could safely enter service. Under normal circumstances, that might have happened. But these weren't normal circumstances. America was now fully at war. Every month of delay meant more American lives lost across the Pacific. Military leaders believed they simply couldn't wait. The B-29 had to reach combat, even if it wasn't ready. So production continued. Factories pushed ahead at an astonishing pace. Workers assembled aircraft while engineers were still redesigning major components. Modification teams often installed improvements on bombers that had already left the production line. Some aircraft required weeks of changes before they could even be accepted by the military. Others were flown directly from the factory to modification centres, where hundreds of additional fixes were made before the crews ever saw them. It was an extraordinary situation. America wasn't just building an airplane. It was rebuilding it while it was already in production. The men assigned to fly the B-29 quickly learned about its reputation. Training crews joked that surviving the flight to combat was only half the challenge. The other half was surviving the airplane itself. Every takeoff demanded enormous engine power. Every climb tested cooling systems to their limits. Flight engineers constantly monitored cylinder head temperatures, oil pressure and fuel flow. There was little room for error. Managing the engines became a full-time job. Veteran crews understood something that wasn't written in any manual. Treat the engines gently or they might not bring you home. Despite the risks, preparations continued for the bomber's first combat deployment. Because of the enormous distances involved, American planners devised an ambitious strategy. B-29s would operate from airfields in India. From there, they would fly supplies over the Himalayas into China, then launch bombing missions against Japan from Chinese bases. It was an incredibly complicated plan. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare engine had to be flown across some of the world's most dangerous mountains before a single combat mission could even begin. The logistical effort was unlike anything attempted during the war. At last, after years of development, thousands of engineering changes, and countless lives already lost, the B-29 was finally heading toward the Pacific. The bomber that America believed could end the war had reached the front lines. But as its crews were about to discover, its greatest enemy still wasn't Japan. By the summer of 1944, the B-29 had finally reached combat. But reaching the battlefield hadn't solved its problems. It had only exposed them. Flying from bases in India and China, the Superfortress launched its first raids against Japan. The missions were unlike anything American aircrews had attempted before. Some lasted more than 15 hours. The bombers crossed the Himalayas, battled violent weather, navigated over endless stretches of ocean and mountains. Every flight pushed both the aircraft and its crew to their limits. Yet despite the enormous effort, the results were disappointing. Bombing accuracy was poor. Mechanical failures remained common. Engine fires still haunted every mission. The bomber America had invested billions into wasn't delivering the decisive results military leaders had promised. Something had to change. That change arrived in the form of one man, Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay already had a reputation for solving impossible problems. In Europe, he had helped develop the bomber formations that improved the survival of American crews over Germany. Now he was sent to command the B-29 campaign against Japan. When he arrived, he quickly realized the problem wasn't the crews. It wasn't even the airplane. It was the strategy. The B-29 had been designed to bomb from high altitude during daylight. In theory, that kept bombers above enemy defenses. In reality, the skies over Japan introduced an unexpected enemy: the jet stream. At altitudes above 30,000 feet, powerful winds sometimes exceeded 200 miles per hour. Bombs drifted far from their targets. Entire formations missed factories by miles. The higher the bombers flew, the less effective they became. LeMay made a decision that shocked many of his commanders. It was a decision that weighed heavily on him. Lower altitudes meant greater danger for every crew, but continuing to miss their targets meant the campaign could drag on indefinitely. He would send the B-29s in low, very low. The new tactic broke almost every rule American bomber crews had been taught. Instead of flying high above the target, they would fly at night, at altitudes of only 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Most of their defensive guns would even be removed to reduce weight. The crews would rely on speed rather than heavy firepower. Many believed it was suicide. Flying lower meant entering the range of anti-aircraft guns. If Japanese fighters appeared in large numbers, the bombers would be dangerously vulnerable. But LeMay believed the greater risk was continuing a strategy that wasn't working. He was willing to gamble. On the night of March 9, 1945, that gamble began. Nearly 300 B-29 bombers crossed the Japanese coastline toward Tokyo. But this wasn't a conventional bombing raid. Instead of carrying mostly high-explosive bombs, they were loaded with incendiaries. The purpose wasn't simply to destroy individual factories. It was to ignite the city itself. Tokyo's homes were largely built from wood and paper. Once the fires started, they spread with terrifying speed. Individual blazes merged into an enormous firestorm. Winds created by the heat fed the flames even further. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath walls of fire. By sunrise, much of Tokyo had been reduced to ashes. It became one of the deadliest air raids in human history. For the B-29, it marked a turning point. The bomber had finally become the strategic weapon its designers had envisioned. At the same time, engineers continued improving the aircraft itself. The Wright R3350 engines were gradually becoming more reliable. Cooling systems were redesigned. Better engine baffles directed airflow more effectively around the rear cylinders. Fuel and oil systems were improved. Maintenance crews developed new inspection procedures. Pilots learned engine management techniques that reduced overheating during takeoff and climb. The dangerous engine fires never disappeared completely, but they became far less common than they had been during the bomber's early days. The airplane that had once terrified its own crews was slowly earning their confidence. As American forces captured islands closer to Japan, the B-29 situation improved even further. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam transformed the bombing campaign. Instead of operating from distant bases in India and China, the Superfortress could now fly directly from the Mariana Islands. The complicated supply route over the Himalayas disappeared. Bomb loads increased. Mission planning became simpler. Maintenance improved. Sortie rates climbed dramatically. For the first time, the B-29 could fully exploit its incredible range. Japan was now within regular striking distance. Then another island changed the lives of countless airmen. Iwo Jima. Captured after one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, the small volcanic island became much more than a fighter base. It became a lifeline. For exhausted crews limping home on failing engines, the sight of Iwo Jima rising from the Pacific often meant the difference between life and death. Thousands of damaged B-29s that could never have reached the Mariana Islands safely now had somewhere to land. Engines failed, fuel leaked, hydraulic systems broke, battle damage accumulated. Instead of ditching into the Pacific, many crews reached Iwo Jima just in time. By the end of the war, more than 2,000 B-29 emergency landings had been made there. Tens of thousands of American airmen owed their lives to that tiny island. For an aircraft once infamous for killing its own crews, it was a remarkable change. Now, far more crews were coming home. Mission by mission, the Superfortress tightened its grip on Japan, factories producing aircraft, oil refineries, shipyards, rail junctions, industrial centres. The B-29 carried larger bomb loads farther than any bomber before it. It flew missions that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. America's most ambitious aircraft project had finally fulfilled its promise. The bomber that had nearly been destroyed by its own engineering challenges had become one of the most powerful weapons of the Second World War. But history would remember the B-29 for more than its range, or its technology, or even the devastating firebombing campaign over Japan. Because only a few months later, two B-29s would take off on missions unlike any the world had ever seen. And their names would be remembered forever: Enola Gay, Boxcar. By the summer of 1945, the B-29 Superfortress had finally become the aircraft its designers had dreamed of. The engine fires that had once plagued the program had been reduced. Maintenance procedures had improved. Crews understood how to manage the powerful Wright R3350 engines. After years of setbacks, sacrifice, and relentless engineering, the B-29 had become America's most powerful weapon in the Pacific. But its most important missions still lay ahead. In complete secrecy, a small number of B-29s were selected for a project unlike anything in military history. Known as the 509th Composite Group, these crews trained under Colonel Paul Tibbets. Their aircraft were specially modified to carry an entirely new kind of weapon. Bomb bays were altered, weight was reduced wherever possible. Every detail was designed around a mission that only a handful of people fully understood. On the morning of August 6, 1945, one of those bombers lifted off from Tinian. Its name was Enola Gay. Hours later, over Hiroshima, it released the world's first atomic bomb used in war. The explosion devastated the city. Tens of thousands of people were killed, with many more dying later from injuries and radiation. The world had entered the atomic age. 3 days later, another B-29 took to the skies. Its name was Bockscar. After cloud cover obscured its primary target, the crew diverted to Nagasaki and released a second atomic bomb. Again, the destruction was immense. Again, countless lives were lost. The debate over the bombings continues to this day. Historians, political leaders, and survivors still disagree over whether they were necessary. What cannot be disputed is that the B-29 became the aircraft that delivered the weapons that forever changed warfare. Less than a week later, Japan announced its intention to surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, the Second World War officially came to an end. For the men who had designed, built, maintained, and flown the B-29 Victory, came with memories of the crashes, the engine fires, and the friends who never returned from test flights. The bomber had demanded an extraordinary price before it ever proved its worth. The Superfortress continued serving during the Korean War, but aviation was changing rapidly. Jet fighters like the MiG-15 could now outrun and outclimb the great piston-engine bomber. Within a few years, newer jet-powered bombers replaced it in frontline service. Even so, the B-29 left a lasting legacy. Its pressurized cabins, advanced fire control systems, and long-range capabilities influenced generations of military and civilian aircraft. Many of the ideas pioneered on the Superfortress would later appear in aircraft designed for the jet age. It wasn't simply another bomber. It was one of the most technologically advanced airplanes ever built during the Second World War, and it helped shape the future of long-range aviation. Looking back, it's remarkable how close the entire program came to failure. The B-29 pushed aviation technology further than ever before. It demanded more powerful engines, more advanced systems, more complex engineering. Those ambitions came at a terrible cost. Test pilots lost their lives. Factory workers were killed. Combat crews climbed into an aircraft that still carried serious risks. Before the B-29 defeated the enemy, it first had to survive itself. But engineers refused to quit. Every crash was investigated, every weakness addressed. Every improvement brought the bomber one step closer to fulfilling its promise. That determination transformed one of America's most dangerous aircraft into one of the most capable bombers ever built. Today, only a handful of B-29s remain airworthy. When their 4 massive engines come to life, they remind us of an aircraft unlike any other. The B-29 will always be remembered for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but its story began long before those missions. It began with engineers chasing an impossible dream, test pilots willing to risk everything, and crews who climbed into an aircraft that had not yet earned their trust. In the end, they didn't just build a bomber. Every time one of the last flying B-29 starts its 4 Wright R-3350 engines, it reminds us how close this aircraft came to disappearing before it ever changed history. The B-29 Superfortress didn't just help end the Second World War, it forever changed aviation and history. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the aircraft, engineering breakthroughs, and untold stories that shaped World War II. And let me know in the comments which legendary aircraft, engine, or weapon should we cover next Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.